Agile TD Mondays. Today, Jean-Paul will talk about how to increase the chance for successful DevOps. Hello, Jean-Paul. Welcome. It's a pleasure having you.
Hello, Sabine. I'm glad to be here.
As I've mentioned last week, you can submit your proposal for Agile TD's call for paper and also even book your tickets for Europe's greatest Agile testing software festival. All the information you need you can find on the Agile Testing Days homepage. Enough said, let us start it with Jean-Paul.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jean-Paul Varwijk. I work for a large Dutch bank and I have my own little company. And recently, the bank that I work at moved to DevOps. Well, not so recent, actually 2 years ago. And since then, a lot has changed. And one of the things that I ran into is the notion of radical automation and a shift left movement. And since I was confronted with that, I wanted to know more about it. And I thought I would share that to all of you, what I found out. And what I found out also is that there are ways to do this more successful or less successful, and I would like to share with you what I found that worked quite successful at Rabobank, and what I think is one of the better ways of doing it, although that all depends on your own context. As said, it's called Shift Left the Right Way, and it's meant to increase your chance of succeeding. Well, it's all a bit relative. So what I wanted to do is first share some historical context. Where did this all come from? Because shift left doesn't come out of thin air. So I delved somewhat back into history, and I found that it actually started quite long ago. And it actually started with Winston Royce and his description of what later became known as waterfall. And as you can see, there is this cascading movement from system requirements to software requirements and so forth through coding, testing, and into operations. And as Royce himself described, that he believed in the concept, but it is very risky and invites failure. And his solution to mitigate that was actually something that has influenced software development for a very long time. That was to add a lot of checks and documents and reviews and such. As you can see in the picture, there are really a lot of points where you document stuff. But what he also found out is that none of the actual stages in waterfall act on their own. They influence each other. And he pointed that out with the arrow you see going from testing to program design and from program design to software requirements. But still, what kind of happened with this model is that it moved to something like this, which is Department of Defense, 1976. This is what I would say is a kind of V model, although the term V model was coined later, I think. I think by Paul Rook in 1986. But still, it looks very familiar. And what you see here is that the Department of Defense had an idea that you move through time and you move from detailed specifications down to code and up to all kinds of tests and all kinds of documentation. I think this is the most documentation heavy version of the V module that I've ever seen. And clearly, this is something, if you take that into account, it's not something that we are currently doing anymore. With the arrival of Agile in the late 90s, and you saw a movement away from this. And I think since 2010, it actually became quite mainstream. So what in practice did did survive. That is still the basic concept, that there is this staged sequence in which things happen, and which is analysis, development, testing, and operations. And what you see, the dotted line express, is that operations is something that was typically something that was in production, as where the other three were in the IT department, or for analysis, maybe also at the business side, but not really in production. There was no code involved at that point, and there were really defined roles. And you see these roles still exist nowadays, even in the agile world. And for a long time, the whole waterfall notion meant that a lot of documentation was needed to hand over. And what you now see is that there is a movement against this, because in agile you already see that people don't believe in waterfall anymore. They like to work collaboratively and simultaneously. But for some reason, now that DevOps has become more mainstream, the shift left movement has come to life. And let me share that why I think that is happening, because quite recently, Donald Firesmith identified 4 types of shift left testing. And the earliest version of that I could find was in 2015. And he seems to be very well known with this. And that kind of surprised me. So I wanted to look into this and see what he was talking about. And what I saw is that he identified 4 different types. One is traditional shift left. And that is the type that I find most recognizable, because that is basically, as he calls it, the traditional shift left is moving operations down the V. So moving to the left. But it's still the V model. So I was kind of, But still, let's look what he found on other models. And then I thought, okay, if this is your first model, and he said this is the oldest one, I called it traditional. And then he comes with the incremental shift left, where you see that it not only moves down the V, but there are actually multiple Vs. So operational testing and testing in general moves earlier on into the sequence of things, which is all very nice, but it's still not why this links to DevOps, I thought. And so it turns out he had a third model called Agile DevOps Shift Left. And looking at this, what I see is, well, you made the V smaller, which is interesting, because that is actually what I see a lot happening in reality, where Agile more or less is incremental waterfall, like rapid waterfall. And this is typically where I see it, and I saw it kind of in the bank I work. In the beginning, when we tried to use Agile, you saw that the easiest solution for people to implement this actually was to adopt a way of working that, okay, well, yes, we're no longer doing waterfall as such, but we're implementing Agile, but basically we implement Agile by doing the same thing faster, which is all very nice, but it didn't really work. So I got interested in and we moved to DevOps more or less to circumvent that, and it seems to work very well for us currently. But I'm slightly intrigued that Firesmith thought this was the DevOps model as well. But then he said, well, the future of shift left is actually not this. It is this, model-based shift left, which is kind of odd, because it looks like recreating the original model more or less, and make it a double V, and something that, well, a lot of people have done already. But then he explained that model-based shift left actually is not about the model base that some of you might know, is that have model-based tests or something that coming from a tool where that is automated and that kind of uses UML or some language to formulate the requirements and runs all the tests automatically. That's not what he means. What he means here is something that I actually saw in New York a while ago, and I saw also happening in a few other companies, is you design a model of what you want to have achieved with the software, and you use that as an oracle to set off that what you are testing against, which I think is a pretty neat idea, but I don't quite get why you would still need the division in the V model that he has. So I started to think about it. So how do we now implement this in practice? And how could we make that better? And I've tried to implement that in a few teams as well. And I'm currently trying to implement that in a large project I'm working on that started a couple of months ago. And that is the more practical approach, where if you go back to the basic elements, it is actually what you actually do is planning, development, testing and staging, you do productions, and you have operations. If you take those elements as something of a model, and you then look at what shift left could mean, is that you shift operations to the left and you shift testing to the left as well. Shifting testing to the left is nothing new. That many might argue that that's what we've been calling for ages already. But traditionally, when people were saying moving testing to the left, they meant is that they wanted to have early access to requirements so that they could start their design as early as possible. And this is not what shift left means here. I think it is more that not only you get earlier access, you actually test earlier. So it doesn't mean that you just design a test, but you actually execute the test as early as possible. And the same goes for operations. Operations has some typical attributes that you want to see that it works in production as well, and it runs in production, and it is maintainable, and you don't get any problems. So you want those checks to move to the earliest possible state. And if you go on to that, then if you paste that onto DevOps, what you see is what most people have. They build a delivery pipeline that stretches basically from development into production. And to achieve that, what they typically do is, well, they start by building a single source repository, automate the build, make the build self-testing, make it possible for everybody to commit on a daily basis and to get broken builds fixed immediately. Basically, the concepts of continuous integration and continuous deployment. And you want the software to be deployable throughout the lifecycle. So you want to have fast feedback on its production readiness, which is all very fine, and that will give you a delivery pipeline, and you can use all kinds of tooling for that. But that doesn't quite cover shift left for me. So I have a few extensions to this idea, which first of all entails continuous testing. Continuous testing to me is not that testing just moves to the left in terms of design, but in the whole concept of moving testing to the left and to the right as well, actually, is that testing becomes a common mindset, so that everything, if you talk about when to do stuff, how to develop stuff, that you talk about testability immediately, you talk about acceptance criteria, you talk about how to test it. So it's all about continuous thinking about testability and what that means to the product and what that means to to how customers use it, what it means to actual deployment. So continuously thinking about what testing means to where you are in the product and what you're doing to that product in every stage that you work. And what you then see is that to be able to do that, you actually need additional information. It isn't enough that you have, when stuff is happening or what it's supposed to do, that you have access to requirements or user stories or whatever, or that you have built-in sanity checks and other tests so that the pipeline works. You also need to monitor what the software actually does. So how does it behave? So you want to see, you have what is the usage of the software, supply some metrics on behavior, the system health. But next to that, more practical IT related stuff, there's also a part of continuous monitoring that people sometimes seem to forget, and that is actually a risk management aspect of that. That also feeds into continuous testing whenever something is found. And the risk management aspect of that is that you want continuous information on the authorization processes inside the system, what kind of audit trail there is, who's doing what. And that helps you to figure out new test scenarios as well. So the whole idea of this is that you continuously see what the system is doing in every stage. So in every part of development, whenever you move it, you already integrate the idea that once it is in operation, you want to know about how the system is performing, how it's being used, if there are any latencies or other things that might be stressful for the system. And that brings something to organize this. You also need continuous planning, because as you go along, it's very unlikely that any plan that was written prior, something that happened in the beginning when we moved to Agile, is that we would still write a project initiation document. And then it would be a timeline and milestones and such. And unfortunately, in Agile, and especially in DevOps, reality doesn't behave according to such a plan. So what you saw is that it is not that you document some timeline and set milestones. It is that you have frequent discussions on how development is progressing and where you want to go next. So in the beginning of every sprint, you have a sprint planning in which you discuss with your product owner what you're going to do in the next, in our case, 2 weeks. But you also need to think a little bit further ahead, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, maybe 3 months ahead of time. And it might be really fuzzy, but you need to think ahead on what it means that you're moving forward. What are the things you will encounter and you need to investigate? And then take in what I think is most important as well, is that it is not something that only a project manager or the product owner or scrum master should do. It is something that the whole team should do, and should be aware that if you're working with other teams, that you should collaborate not only within the team, but with other teams as well, because especially in the environment where I'm working in, there are huge dependencies on each other. Not only is my program itself, the system that I'm working on involves around 60 people. There are about 100 people from other systems that will use output or provide input to the system that I'm working on. So the collaboration part is very, very, very important for me. And even if you're just a small application, you're building a web app or something for a phone, take into account that you need to work together and figure out what you're doing, and take into account that you need to know stuff from other people as well, and you need to know to figure out what the dependencies are, and if sometimes you can work together better, or work alone for a short while and then reiterate back into the mainstream. So this is basically a set of continuouses that I want to complete with a last one, and it's actually continuous feedback and improvement. While the first ones have a notion of having focus on progress, so getting through the development process and working towards an end goal, there's also something what I call continuous feedback and improvement, is that you have to take into account how things are going, what you get back from all the reporting and talking that you are doing, and what this means and how you can use that to improve. In Agile terminology, this would be done at the end of the sprint, called a retrospective. And I would say actually make that more continuous. Maybe make the retrospective the focal point in where you bring all that together, but take into account that you don't have to wait 2 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever your sprint length is. You can learn immediately from what all the testing, monitoring, and collaboration is providing you. The system is feeding you information, people are feeding you information, and you can talk with them and ask how to improve things. So this is how we at Rabobank now currently are trying to build a kind of model in which we work together and realize that it's not just the technical stuff of the delivery pipeline, which in itself can be challenging enough to automate everything and automate the integration and deployment part. It is also not just the continuous testing, in which if to do that well, you also need a lot of automated testing, but automated testing is just a part of it. There's still the actual testing part of it, because you usually automate the checks that you have figured out through testing, and there's still exploratory testing going on. And that through monitoring, you can actually see what's going on in the system, other than through incidents or bug reports, just by looking at the regular behavior and how people move through the system. And that might feed back into the requirements, the planning, and the testing itself. And in order to do that, you need to work together and take into account, but that what you learn also needs to lead into better ways of doing it. So that, to me, kind of makes shift left the right way, is that, yes, it shifts left because everything shifts left because it was originally on the right side of the waterfall or V model. And to me, it kind of spreads out all over the place, specifically continuous testing, continuous monitoring, and the collaboration part. And some of the parts like planning and integration and deployment, yes, they do move forward in time because you are moving forward in time with your product. But that doesn't mean that you don't do that constantly and have to do it in a way that is very efficient and effective. That kind of concludes my webinar so far, and my sharing of my thoughts about this with you.
There are no questions, but if you have questions, you can contact Jean-Paul on his Twitter account, and he also has a webpage. And now I would like to tell you who's going to be my guest next week. Next week, Selena DeLacy will talk about how to embrace your inner leader, and will show you how a tester can become a remarkable leader. Thank you, Jean-Paul, for your talk. I enjoyed it very much.
You're welcome. And I hope everybody online enjoyed it as much. And like Sabine said, please contact me if you have any questions.
Thank you. And I see you all next week.
Goodbye.